Well, I'm going to begin head removal by taking the water pump off. Some 10 millimeters under here, loose, loose. That one just came out. So much for those 10s. Let's go on to see what these, that brings up a whole other bunch of stuff to talk about. Loose. Somewhat tight. Just a few inches. Well, one of the fellows that was sending in comments mentioned how he was interested that not using power tools to get these things apart. And so he brought up a very good point that those two bolts that were holding in the start-stop solenoid were really hard to turn out. I couldn't do it by fingers tight. And had I been using a speed wrench or a ratchet, powered ratchet of some sort, I wouldn't have been able to tell that those were odd. From what I can tell, the front gear case doesn't look like it's been off, but then when I get over here and look at different places, there's a coating of that original plastic type paint, and then there's been paint here. This chip it has metal underneath it. It's a different tone. It's a real flat finish. And the water pump is a glossy black, even out here where the hose was. From what I can tell though, it still doesn't look like it's been removed, but the drive shaft does. My first thinking was that they'd done an in-frame overhaul by putting in new pistons or at least new rings. This would be in line with what we've seen with those loose bolts and such. Another interesting thing is the presence of rust in the vicinity of the head gasket. Well, I didn't expect that. Well, that shows you can't be too careful. Probably doing these videos and going up and editing, I just didn't drain the block, but it's drained now. Well, the other reason to pull this head is number 1 and number 3 are probably good pistons. Number 2 is probably bad because it's interfered with the head and the valves. The replacement block is standing by, so the question will be what can be reused in the rebuild. To take the injector lines off, I'm going to take this little stainless steel brush and just get a little bit of the dust that's accumulated around the top of those lines and the nuts. Maybe get some of that just knocked out of the way. I take a 17 millimeter and just bring them loose. I might mention, and I'll probably mention it again, that the Yanmar in this tractor application it's starting to turn, but it's held captive, and it's quite tight too. That they number their engines number 1 at the flywheel end with 3 at the fan in the front end. That one's finger tight. Number 2 is finger tight to a point. Did I say that wrong? Number 1 is now coming loose okay. Number 3 is in the air. And number 2 is finger tight. There was some stress against them sideways. A nice feature on the 855 injection pump are these fuel delivery valves that are locked in place with these blocks and bolts. On the 7 and 655, you have to run a wrench back down somehow to hold that center one. But we're good here. Let's see if we can get these two outside ones loose. And number 3. So since we can't get the 17 millimeter in there to get a good catch on that nut, we're going to use our 9/32 to take this clamp loose. And it doesn't look like it's been loose before, does it? So now we can continue with pulling our lines off. You don't need to be afraid of these. Just need to keep them clean. The lines out of the way, we want to put some caps on our pump and injectors for now. We're going to start by putting on a flexible universal coupling and getting this first intake bolt loosened. Now the oil level bracket. I don't know if this tube is going to come out of the crankcase just yet, but we'll get it loose here so the manifold will be able to come off. These two bolts are of different length, so I'll put them back in their corresponding holes. Well, there we have a tight bolt. Evidently it was easy to get to. Tight. And there we have it. Now we'll move the clamps from the injection return lines. Take those little hoses loose. Oops, coming pretty easy. Yeah, these things are a lot easier to take apart if there's been somebody in here recently. And now we can pull the injector keepers. And they are to be balanced when you tighten them, so that they come down square on the injector. But you loosen one and they both feel loose. You notice how that worked? There will be dirt in here, so when you pull it off, make sure there isn't any down in there. Could have gotten the air, blown it out. Maybe I'll do that before I do these next ones. Well, at this point, the number 1 injector is loose. There is dirt down around here, but since this engine has got to be a major replacement anyway, I'm going to go ahead and see if this one pulls out. Very easy, just so you can see how it does work. Some kind of a number on it. An appropriate tool to get the injector out is a slide hammer and an adapter that goes over the threaded portion of the injector. And then you fix your slide hammer, in this case a threaded bolt with a weight, and we tap it out. Maybe. Rusty. We'll try number 2. Also rusty. We want to take a closer look at this injector. And there's number 2. Looks wet. And it has some loose carbon on it. This injector out of cylinder 3, notice it's fairly dry. Just a normal type of carbon buildup around it. There. Here's injector number 1. Looks similar, dry, charcoal, gray, dry finish. Take our valve cover, special 12mm bolts off. Before removing the rocker assembly, I noticed that the exhaust rocker on cylinder 1 was quite loose, and what I found was 18 thousandths clearance when it should have just 8, and this intake is down, so this should be clear. Swinging over to number 3 cylinder, the exhaust valve is down, so that means intake is up, and I can measure just 6 thousandths clearance here. Should be 8. Because I thought it might be interesting, I thought I'd go ahead and bar the engine over a couple of revolutions to see what happens with these valves. So 2's going. So I checked all of the clearances, and I got anywhere from 18 thousandths to 6 thousandths. So without any further ado, let's take the rocker arms off. Now, so they won't get lost, I'll pull these caps. I'm keeping everything in order in case we have to use this camshaft in the next engine. We can have the same rockers, tappets, and caps. So while we have the motor holding on to it, we'll take our exhaust manifold off. Well, these are 12mm. They all seem good and tight. What about this one? Well, I just happen to have a 13mm handy. I'll bet that's what that is. Sure is. Mismatched bolt. Why do I find this 13mm among 12mm bolts significant? I don't like surprises. Here again, this manifold is held on with a mismatched fastener. Pretty new. If the objective is to hold it on, that 13mm bolt will do just fine. But there's more to it than that. If you remember, the muffler was held onto the manifold with a different size nut, and it was loose. Another way to look at this, 3 out of 10 fasteners, or 30%, were not OEM. Before I take the head off, I'm going to try to re-torque the head bolts to see how tight they are Should be 51 foot-pounds. And if the engine had run any period of time, this should have been done like after 50 hours. But let's see where they break. It's sitting at 51. $13, and the rusty one. Okay, so they all seem to be torqued right about 51 pounds. Just a good note, if you're using a good wrench, never leave it engaged. Always back it off down to the zeros. After a quick swig of coffee and a change of wrenches, we're going to start backing these off a little bit, just a bit at a time. About a quarter of a turn. This is like doing a reverse tightening sequence, just in case we need to use the head. 13, 14. Now I think we can go ahead and take them loose. The bolt should have had a good coating of oil on the threads and the bolt when they were installed. They look okay. Well, I'm a little curious about the rust on number 14, but I'm also curious about the rust around the injector holes. Looks like all the threads were oiled. And these won't be going back in this block, so we can take them out without trying to put them back in the same holes. I'm interested in the appearance of rust around the head gasket. Any leaking coolant that we had in the last day or so, or some oil, has kind of darkened the rusty areas. But the presence of rust in the injector ports is interesting too. Well, okay, Henry, it's time for her head to come off. I'll pull the head gasket off if I can. Here we go. These are supposed to be assembled dry. Maybe it was. There's no ring groove and still honing marks on the cylinder wall. Number 2. I want to put my observations on the camera. What I notice is this cylinder has been working pretty hard. It's gray and dry. Similar on number 3. Number 2 doesn't look like it, but it's been doing much. These areas where the valves must have been hitting. We'll look at the bottom of the head next. Well, definitely I can see where this piston has been in contact with the head. We can see the print of the A there, the combustion chamber. There's number 3 coming out of number 2. You can see where the piston has left an imprint on the head and valves. And cylinder 1 looks like it's been normal. I'm not sure what the deal is on this head gasket. I've not seen this kind of material, at least the stock one from Myanmar didn't. But it doesn't look like it's been leaking anywhere, so it's been sealing well. Well, we're noticing other little abnormalities and anomalies. Pay attention to these 2 coolant holes here. They're here, here, not here, not here. I can't tell if they were plugged. But they look like the gasket has imprinted a look. And why does this matter? Well, the head gasket shows that these holes exist. And a different head shows these holes exist. They're coolant holes. Now that the engine is ready to pull, we're at a good stopping point for part 3. Each step has provided additional insight into how previous work on this tractor and engine was performed. Coming up in part 4, we're going to turn it upside down and find out what happened inside, whether the failure was a part, assembly, or both.